Hello. In this video, we're going to derive the derivative of the inverse secant function by applying the inverse function theorem. That theorem says that if f and g are inverses, then f prime of x is equal to 1 over g prime of f of x. In this case, we have f of x equals the inverse secant of x, and g of x is its inverse secant x. So our first step is to find g prime of x. And the derivative of secant is secant x times tangent x. But we don't want g prime of x. We want g prime of f of x. So in place of each of the x's, we substitute f of x, and we get g prime of f of x is equal to secant of f of x times the tangent of f of x. And we know that f of x is inverse secant of x, so we'll make that substitution and get secant of the inverse secant of x times the tangent of the inverse secant of x. At this point, we're going to try and simplify our result. What we need to remember from trigonometry is that inverse trig functions are angles. So we're going to let inverse secant of x be equal to theta, and we'll represent that in a right triangle. Up here at the top, I'm going to remind myself that theta is equal to inverse secant of x. But that means that secant of theta is equal to x, and another way of writing x is as a fraction, x over 1. Now, what we need to recall from trigonometry is that secant is the reciprocal of cosine, and in a right triangle, cosine is the adjacent side over the hypotenuse. So that means that secant is the hypotenuse over the adjacent side. So we're going to label the hypotenuse as x and the adjacent side as 1. Then using the Pythagorean theorem, we can determine that the opposite side is the square root of x squared minus 1. Now in our formula, we want to find the secant of theta, but we already know that the secant of theta is x. We also need to find the tangent of theta. So recall that tangent of an angle is the opposite over the adjacent side. So in this case, the opposite side is the square root of x squared minus 1, and the adjacent side is 1. So tangent of theta is just the square root of x squared minus 1. So now we can go ahead and substitute. The secant of the inverse secant of x will just be x, which makes sense because secant and inverse secant are undoing one another, just leaving us with x, and then multiplied by the tangent of theta, and that is the square root of x squared minus 1. So now that we've found g prime of f of x, now we're ready to find the derivative of the inverse secant function. We have f prime of x is the reciprocal of what we just came up with. So we just put 1 over x times the square root of x squared minus 1. So in summary, the derivative of the inverse secant function is equal to 1 over x times the square root of x squared minus 1.